The cold, heavy steel of the Glock in my hands felt like the absolute end of the world. My finger was completely rigid against the trigger guard. Across the expansive space of the penthouse, the silence was so thick it was physically suffocating. I didn't look at the 4 elite guards aiming their assault rifles directly at my chest. I didn't look down at Minho, the 35-year-old billionaire who controlled the criminal underworld, currently paralyzed and gasping for air on the floor beside my feet. I kept the barrel of the gun aimed perfectly between the impeccably plucked eyebrows of Madame Han. "Call them off," I said, my voice vibrating with an ancient, freezing rage that I didn't even know I possessed. "Call off the snipers at my mother's compound. Right now." My heart slammed against my ribs, a frantic, bruising rhythm. I was 22 years old. Just weeks ago, my biggest fear was scraping together enough pounds to pay my tuition at the Royal College of Music. Now, my long black coils were plastered to my neck with cold sweat, the heavy ochre fabric of my dress brushing against Minho's trembling shoulder as I held the most powerful woman in Seoul at gunpoint. Madame Han didn't flinch. Her dark, calculating eyes, the exact same pitch-black eyes as her son's, bored into mine. She was searching for a tremor, a micro-expression of weakness, a bluff. She was waiting for the poor, desperate Nigerian girl to break. But I am my father's daughter. Before he passed, a strong Igbo man who built his life from the red dust of Enugu, he taught me that true power isn't in the weapon you hold, but in the absolute certainty of your spirit. I anchored my feet into the floor. I didn't blink. I pulled the hammer of the gun back with my thumb. The metallic click severed the tension in the room like a blade. Madame Han's perfectly painted lips twitched. For a fraction of a second, I thought she was going to order her men to fire. I braced my body, preparing to pull the trigger, preparing to die right here in this penthouse if it meant my mother lived. But the icy, terrifying mask of the Syndicate's architect slowly began to crack. The sheer malice in her eyes softened, melting into something entirely unexpected. She smiled. It wasn't a cruel smirk. It was a genuine, terrifyingly proud smile. She slowly raised her hand, her manicured fingers gesturing to the heavily armed guards. "Lower your weapons," she commanded, her voice smooth and echoing in the massive room. The guards instantly dropped their rifles, assuming parade rest. Madame Han reached into the pocket of her flawless Chanel blazer and pulled out a sleek, encrypted communicator. "Command actually. Stand down." All units at the Enugu compound withdrew immediately. The target is no longer in play. She tapped the screen of the tablet she was holding and turned it toward me. The live feed showed the dark shadows around my mother's small house emptying. The snipers were gone. Hey, quick pause. If your heart is pounding out of your chest right now and you cannot believe this insane plot twist, make sure to write a comment, subscribe, and like Story's Pulse. This is part 2 of this particular story, so if you missed how we got to this deadly standoff, check the description below for part 1. Now let's get back to the intense aftermath. The immense, crushing weight on my chest evaporated so fast I nearly dropped the gun. My hands began to shake uncontrollably as the adrenaline crashed through my system. Madame Han stepped forward, ignoring the weapon still loosely pointed in her direction. She looked down at Minho, who was struggling to push himself up on one elbow, his breathing shallow from the neuroinhibitor, ravaging his nervous system. "I monitored your background using our sophisticated AI tools for business operations," Madame Han said, her gaze shifting back to me. "The data algorithms told me you were a liability. A poor, struggling student drowning in debt. I assumed you were just another opportunist looking to exploit my son's wealth for private wellness retreats, luxury shopping, or a backdoor payout. The data told me you would run the moment the reality of our world threatened your peace." She stepped closer, stopping mere inches from the barrel of the Glock. "The data was wrong," she whispered, her eyes filled with a sudden, overwhelming respect. She looked down at her son again. "You didn't choose a mouse, Minho. You chose a lioness. She is worthy." The gun slipped from my trembling fingers, clattering loudly against the marble. I immediately dropped to my knees, the heavy Ankara fabric pooling around me as I reached for Minho. "Park!" Madame Han barked, her voice suddenly entirely maternal and sharp. "Coordinate the emergency protocol. Get my son immediate medical care after the injury he sustained. Flush that neuroinhibitor from his system before it causes permanent damage." Mr. Park scrambled into action, rushing to the medical kit that had been abandoned on the counter. I didn't care about the guards or the billionaire matriarch standing over us. I slid my arms under Minho's broad, muscular shoulders, pulling his heavy frame against my chest. His skin was freezing, covered in a slick layer of sweat. "Minho," I gasped, my fingers frantically tracing the sharp line of his jaw, moving up to push the damp, gold-brown hair out of his eyes. "Stay with me. Just look at me." His pitch-black eyes fluttered open, finding mine with a desperate, consuming hunger. Even paralyzed, even fighting for air, the intense, obsessive devotion in his stare made my breath hitch. "You held your ground," he breathed, his voice a ragged, beautiful rumble vibrating against my collarbone. "My beautiful, terrifying girl." "Don't talk," I cried, pulling him closer, pressing my face into the crook of his neck. The scent of him, gunpowder, expensive rain, and pure, unfiltered danger filled my lungs. "Just breathe. The war is over." She called them off. Park slid onto the floor next to us, a specialized auto-injector in his hand. He pressed it against Minho's uninjured shoulder. A sharp hiss filled the air as the antidote rushed into his bloodstream. Madame Han watched us for a long moment, the silence no longer suffocating, but heavy with a new, unspoken understanding. "When he is stabilized," she said quietly, smoothing the lapels of her blazer, "I expect you both to join me for breakfast. We have an empire to restructure, and I need to properly introduce myself to my future daughter-in-law." She turned on her heel and walked toward the private elevator, her guards silently falling into step behind her. The door slid shut, sealing us in the golden sanctuary of the penthouse. Within minutes, the antidote began to work. The terrifying rigidity in Minho's muscles slowly dissolved. Park respectfully bowed his head, quietly retreating to the outer security perimeter, leaving us completely alone in the sprawling living space. Minho didn't try to stand. Instead, he shifted his weight, his large, scarred hands reaching up to grip my waist. With a sudden, surprising surge of reclaimed strength, he pulled me down entirely onto the floor with him. I gasped as my back hit the plush rug, his massive, heavy body instantly covering mine. He didn't rest his full weight on me, but he caged me in completely, his broad shoulders blocking out the ambient light of the city's skyline. The dark, intricate Korean Syndicate dragon tattoo creeping up the left side of his neck flexed as he buried his face in the thick, dark coils of my hair. He was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling against mine in a rapid, frantic rhythm. The physical contact was electric. Every nerve ending in my body ignited as his hands moved from my waist, sliding up my arms, his thumbs tracing the frantic pulse at my wrists. "You were willing to pull the trigger," he whispered, his lips brushing against the sensitive skin just beneath my ear. The raw, possessive heat in his voice sent a violent shiver straight down my spine. "I was protecting my mother," I managed to say, my voice breathy and weak against the overwhelming proximity of him. Minho lifted his head. His handsome face was inches from mine, his sharp jawline tight with an emotion so deep it looked like actual pain. He moved his hands, gently framing my face, his thumbs wiping away the dried tears on my cheeks. "You protected us," he corrected softly. He slowly lowered his head until his forehead rested heavily against mine. "I have lived in complete darkness for 35 years, Sasha. I was perfectly willing to burn my own empire to ash to keep you safe. But you didn't let me. You stood up to the devil herself and claimed my throne." The sensual tension between us was a physical, heavy blanket. I couldn't look away from his dark eyes. The total, unyielding obsession radiating from him was intoxicating. He didn't need to force a kiss. The deep, agonizing restraint in his touch, the way he breathed me in like I was the only oxygen left on Earth, was more intimate than anything I had ever experienced. "I am never letting you out of my sight again," he vowed, his thumb softly tracing the line of my bottom lip. "You're my peace. You're my queen. And this entire world now belongs to you." The morning light filtering into the room did not bring the usual harshness of a London dawn. Instead, it felt like the entire world had exhaled. I sat on the edge of the massive mattress, watching the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of Minho's chest. The medical care after the injury had been exceptionally thorough. Park had ensured the finest private physicians flushed the remaining neuroinhibitor from his system. Minho was sleeping a deep, restorative sleep that I knew he hadn't experienced in years. Without the terrifying mask of the Ghost of Seoul, without the heavy burden of the Syndicate crushing his shoulders, he looked devastatingly young. The sharp, ruthless angles of his face were softened in the quiet light. I reached out, my fingers trembling slightly, and gently traced the edge of the dark dragon tattoo that crept up the side of his neck. His skin was incredibly warm, a stark contrast to the freezing terror of the night before. As if my touch was a current of electricity, his pitch-black eyes fluttered open. There was no disorientation. The moment he saw me, the raw, unfiltered obsession that anchored his soul rushed back into his gaze. He didn't speak. He simply lifted his heavy, scarred hand and wrapped his long fingers around my wrist, pulling me down until I was lying flush against his side. The sheer strength of his grip was a silent vow. I rested my head on his chest, listening to the steady, thundering beat of his heart. "I was terrified I would wake up and find you gone," he murmured, his voice a deep, gravelly vibration that sent a flush of heat straight to my core. "I am not going anywhere," I whispered, shifting closer so my cheek rested against his bare skin. "The war is over, Minho. We are safe." He turned his body, caging me in slightly, his broad shoulders shielding me from the rest of the room. He buried his face in my thick, dark coils, inhaling deeply. Safety was a concept I never believed in, he confessed, the vulnerability in his tone making my chest ache. For years, the Hansong Foundation funded extensive trauma therapy sessions for me. The board paid millions for top-tier psychiatrists and elite wellness retreats, hoping to cure the insomnia and the violent rage that built up in my skull. None of it worked. They were trying to medicate a soul that was entirely empty. He pulled back just enough to look me in the eyes. The emotional gravity in the room was immense. "And then I heard your violin in that station. I saw you. And for the first time in my life, the screaming in my head stopped. You are my only cure, Sasha." The intensity of his gaze made it hard to breathe. He wasn't just a billionaire offering luxury. He was a man laying his entire existence at my feet. I brought my hand up, my thumb gently sweeping across his sharp jawline. He leaned into my touch, his eyes closing in pure, agonizing relief. The sensual tension between us was thick and heavy, a magnetic pull that required absolute restraint. He didn't push for more. He just wanted to feel my heartbeat against his, to know that the woman who had stood between him and death was actually here, breathing and real. "You have to rest," I told him softly, my voice barely a breath. "I am resting," he replied, his forehead dropping heavily against mine. "As long as you are exactly right here, I am perfectly at peace." We stayed like that for hours, wrapped in a quiet, protective bubble. The massive empire outside the door ceased to matter. But the world of the Hansong Syndicate did not pause for long, and by mid-afternoon, the heavy oak doors of the suite opened. I sat up slightly as Madame Han walked in. She was dressed in an immaculate charcoal pantsuit, carrying a sleek tablet. The terrifying, icy matriarch from last night was gone, replaced by a woman who looked at me with a profound, calculating respect. "The medical team assures me his vitals are completely stable," Madame Han said, her tone professional but entirely devoid of malice. She stopped at the foot of the bed, her dark eyes shifting from her son to me. "You handled the crisis with an intellect I rarely see in my own board members, Sasha. You did not panic. You calculated the leverage and you executed the strike. It was flawless." "I did what I had to do," I replied, keeping my posture straight, my chin lifted. "I protect what is mine." A genuine, warm smile touched Madame Han's lips. It was a subtle shift, but it completely transformed her face. "And he is yours," she agreed softly. She looked at Minho, who had tensed slightly, his arm wrapping protectively around my waist. "Relax, Minho. I am not here to plot. I am here to build." She walked over to the small sitting area in the suite and placed the tablet on the glass coffee table. "Sasha, my son's strength has always been his ruthlessness, but an empire cannot survive on fear alone. It requires grace. It requires a mind that understands diplomacy as well as it understands war." The Hansong Foundation manages billions in global charities, funding clean water initiatives, orphanages, and international wellness retreats. I oversee the philanthropic arm to ensure our public image remains untouchable. She paused, looking directly at me. "I am stepping down from that role, and I want you to take it." I blinked, genuinely stunned. "Me? Madame Han, I am a music student. I don't know the first thing about running a multi-billion-dollar global charity." "You're a survivor," Madame Han corrected smoothly, taking a seat and crossing her legs. "You have the resilience of your Nigerian heritage and a mind sharp enough to outmaneuver the Yakuza. The logistics can be taught. Our proprietary AI tools for business operations will handle the predictive modeling and the financial algorithms. What the Foundation needs is a queen. Someone with genuine empathy, someone who understands what it means to struggle, to bring true light to this family's dark legacy." Minho's hand tightened on my waist. I looked down at him, seeing the absolute pride shining in his dark eyes. He wasn't surprised by his mother's offer. He already knew what I was capable of. I slowly stood up from the bed, smoothing down my clothes, and walked over to the sitting area. I sat opposite the woman who, just 24 hours ago, had held my mother's life in her hands. Now we were sitting as equals. "If I take this on," I said, my voice steady, "we do it my way. The charitable funds will not just be a tax shield. The therapy sessions funded by the Foundation for underprivileged communities will be expanded. We will build actual infrastructure, not just public relations stunts." Madame Han's smile widened. She didn't look offended, she looked thrilled. "I would expect nothing less from you. You have a beautiful, terrifying spirit, Sasha. My son is a very lucky man." For the next 2 hours, the tension in the penthouse completely dissolved into a harmonious, focused energy. Madame Han and I sat over the tablet, reviewing the global outreach programs. She was brilliant, patient, and incredibly sharp, explaining the complex financial structures while I pointed out areas where the outreach could be more effective on the ground. We didn't fight. We built. From the bed, Minho watched us silently. I could feel the heat of his gaze tracking every movement I made. Whenever I glanced over at him, the depth of his devotion was entirely visible. He was watching his mother and the woman he loved, the two most powerful forces in his universe, not tearing each other apart, but uniting to solidify his empire. Later that evening, after Madame Han had retired to her own wing of the estate, Minho finally managed to get out of bed. He moved slowly, his body still recovering, but his sheer willpower was undeniable. I was standing by the window, looking out over the London skyline, when I felt his solid chest press against my back. His arms wrapped tightly around my waist, pulling me completely flush against him. He buried his face in the crook of my neck, his lips pressing a soft, lingering kiss against my pulse point. "You conquered her," he whispered, his voice vibrating with absolute awe. "You conquered my mother, you conquered the Syndicate, and you conquered me." "I didn't conquer you, Minho," I murmured, leaning back into his embrace, letting his heat seep into my bones. "I just loved you." He let out a shaky breath, his arms tightening around me as if I might vanish into the night air. The sheer emotional weight of his possession was overwhelming. He didn't need to say another word. The way he held me, as if I were his actual soul manifested in flesh, told me everything I would ever need to know. We had survived the dark, and now we were going to rule the light. 2 weeks had passed since the night the world almost ended in that penthouse. The heavy, suffocating weight of the Syndicate had been replaced by a quiet, protective bubble that Minho absolutely refused to let pop. He had completely taken over my existence, and God help me, I was letting him. The physical recovery from his gunshot wound was astonishing, aided heavily by the concierge medical care after the injury that Park had coordinated. But it was his mental shift that left me breathless. He wasn't the tortured, sleepless ghost of Seoul anymore. The dark circles under his pitch-black eyes had vanished. He was finally sleeping, but only if I was tangled in his arms, my head resting over his heart. Tonight, however, the bubble was going to burst. We were stepping out into the light. Madame Han had personally arranged for my styling team. I sat in front of the massive vanity mirror in the guest wing, my hands trembling slightly in my lap as the makeup artist finished brushing a subtle gold highlight across my dark brown skin. My hair, my thick, natural coils, had been pinned up into a stunning, elegant crown that felt entirely regal. "You are shaking," a smooth, authoritative voice said from the doorway. I looked through the mirror to see Madame Han stepping into the room. She was holding a flat, velvet jewelry box. Over the past 2 weeks, the icy matriarch had thawed into an incredibly sharp, fiercely protective mentor. "I've never been in a room with the entire Korean high society before," I admitted, my voice tight. "Tonight is the chairman's anniversary gala. Half the global shipping tycoons will be there. They're going to look at me and wonder what a Nigerian student is doing on the arm of the Syndicate's heir." "Let them wonder," Madame Han replied softly. She walked up behind me, opening the velvet box. Inside rested a breathtaking, antique diamond choker that caught the vanity lights like liquid fire. "Our family does not explain its choices to lesser empires, Sasha. You are not a student tonight. You are the future of the Hansong Foundation." She gently fastened the diamonds around my neck. The cool metal was a heavy reminder of the world I was officially entering. "Besides," Madame Han added, a rare, wicked amusement in her eyes, "Minho has utilized our proprietary AI tools for business operations to completely restructure the venue's security grid. The entire perimeter is locked down. He isn't worried about rivals tonight. He is only worried about other men looking at you." I let out a breathless laugh, standing up and smoothing down the heavy, emerald green silk of my evening gown. It was a masterpiece, fitting my slender but strong frame perfectly, daring enough to turn heads, but elegant enough to command absolute respect. When I finally walked out into the main living space of the penthouse, the air instantly left the room. Minho was standing by the glass doors, pouring a glass of sparkling water. He was wearing a custom-tailored, midnight blue tuxedo that made his broad, muscular shoulders look impossibly wide. The dark, intricate dragon tattoo creeping up his neck was partially visible above his crisp white collar, a dangerous contrast to the extreme wealth of his clothing. He turned around. He stopped dead in his tracks, his hand freezing midair over the crystal decanter. The silence that stretched between us was agonizingly thick. His pitch-black eyes swept over me, starting from the diamond choker down to the hem of the emerald silk, before snapping back up to my face. The sheer, predatory hunger in his gaze made my knees weak. He didn't look like a billionaire attending a gala. He looked like a starving man who had just been handed the sun. He crossed the room in 3 long, desperate strides. He didn't say a word. He didn't compliment the dress. He just raised his large, warm hands and gently framed my face, his thumbs trembling slightly as they brushed my cheekbones. He leaned down, burying his face in the curve of my neck, inhaling so deeply I felt his chest expand against mine. You are going to drive me insane, he grunted, his voice a rough, vibrating whisper against my skin. I don't want to share you with a room full of people. I want to lock the doors and hide you away. You promised your mother we would make an appearance, I reminded him softly, my hands sliding up his chest to grip the lapels of his tuxedo. The steady, thumping rhythm of his heart beneath the expensive fabric grounded me. I am quickly regretting my promises, he breathed, pulling back just enough to rest his forehead against mine. The intense, burning desire radiating from him was a physical weight. If anyone looks at you too long tonight, I am going to blind them. An hour later, the armored Maybach pulled up to the grand entrance of a historic London estate that had been rented out entirely for the event. The moment the car doors opened, the blinding flash of paparazzi cameras exploded. Minho's hand was a warm, immovable anchor flat against the small of my back. He didn't rush. He guided me up the velvet-carpeted steps with a terrifying, calm authority. I could feel the stares. The hushed whispers of the old-money elites rippled through the crowd as we entered the grand ballroom. I was the only black woman in a sea of foreign dignitaries, rival CEOs, and syndicate bosses. I felt a brief spike of anxiety, but then I looked at the man beside me. Minho was looking down at me with an expression of such absolute, unwavering obsession that the rest of the room simply ceased to matter. He was broadcasting to the entire criminal and corporate underworld that I was his singular weakness, and he dared any of them to do something about it. Madame Han was already holding court near the center of the room. As we approached, I heard her seamlessly dismissing a rival shipping magnate. The Foundation's new initiatives are not open for debate, Madame Han was saying, her tone polite but final. We are focusing our capital on funding specialized therapy sessions funded by the Foundation and global wellness retreats for marginalized communities. My future daughter-in-law, Sasha, will be spearheading the expansion. The magnate blinked, his eyes darting to me in shock before he quickly bowed his head in submission. The real shock of the night, however, was the catering. Minho had personally overseen the menu to ensure I felt completely at home in his intimidating world. As the servers moved through the ballroom, the guests were presented with a breathtaking fusion of our cultures. Beautifully seared cuts of premium Korean hanwoo beef were served alongside perfectly smooth Nigerian pounded yam and incredibly rich, spicy egusi soup. I looked up at Minho, my heart swelling with an emotion so fierce it brought tears to my eyes. He hadn't just brought me into his world, he was forcing his world to respect mine. You did this, I whispered, squeezing his hand. I told you, he murmured, his eyes dark and intent. Everything I have is yours. The intense, possessive energy radiating from him only grew as the night went on. Every time a male guest even approached to offer congratulations, Minho's jaw clenched, his body subtly shifting to place himself between me and the perceived threat. It was primal. It was entirely unnecessary, but God, the sheer devotion of it made my blood run hot. By the third hour of the gala, the tension rolling off him was volatile. Without a word, his hand slid down from my waist, his long fingers wrapping firmly around my wrist. He pulled me away from the crowd, navigating the labyrinth of the historic estate until we stepped out onto a secluded, shadowed stone balcony overlooking the private gardens. The heavy glass doors sealed shut behind us, cutting off the noise of the ballroom. The cold night air was a sharp relief, but the heat coming off Minho's body was scorching. He backed me up against the cold stone wall, stepping firmly between my legs, pinning me entirely in the shadows. He didn't kiss me. He just rested his forearms on the wall beside my head, trapping me in a cage of his own body heat, his chest heaving as he fought for breath. Minho, I gasped, the sensual tension wrapping around my throat like a physical hand. I have spent the last 3 hours watching other men realize how breathtaking you are, he rasped, his pitch-black eyes dropping to my lips. His restraint was shattering. I am trying very hard to be the civilized CEO my mother needs tonight. But I am failing, Sasha. I am failing. He leaned his forehead heavily against mine, his thumbs gently sweeping across my collarbones, grazing the edge of the diamond choker. The raw, unfiltered desire in his touch made my entire body tremble. He wasn't a billionaire at that moment. He was just a man entirely consumed by the woman he loved. "Take me out of here," I whispered, my voice breaking in the dark. His eyes flew open, the dark pupils blown wide with need. "If I take you out of here tonight," he warned, his voice a low, dangerous rumble, "I am not taking you back to the penthouse. I am taking you completely off the grid." He wasn't lying. We didn't even walk back through the ballroom. Minho kept his hand firmly locked around mine, leading me down a hidden spiral staircase that bypassed the entire historic estate and emptied directly into a private underground garage. Mr. Park was already waiting beside a sleek black SUV, the engine humming quietly in the dark. Minho didn't say a word as he handed me into the back seat. He slid in right next to me, his broad shoulders filling the space, his thigh pressing heavily against mine. He reached into his tuxedo jacket, pulled out his encrypted satellite phone, and powered it down entirely. "Sir," Park said from the front seat, glancing in the rearview mirror. "The logistics for the Asian shipping routes. The automated AI tools for business operations can manage the routing matrices for the next 48 hours, Minho interrupted, his voice a low, immovable command. "Divert all emergency protocols to my mother. I am officially unreachable." Park blinked, genuine shock crossing his disciplined features before he quickly nodded. "Understood. The jet is prepped on the private tarmac." I turned to look at Minho as the SUV sped out into the London night. The chaotic glow of the city's streetlights flickered across his incredibly handsome face. He was 35 years old, a man who had spent his entire life anticipating attacks, analyzing threats, and drowning in insomnia. Yet, as he looked back at me, the terrifying aura of the Mafia boss was completely gone. His pitch-black eyes were entirely soft, filled with a desperate, vulnerable kind of devotion that made my chest physically ache. "Where are we going?" I whispered, the heavy emerald silk of my dress rustling as I shifted closer to him. He lifted his hand, his long fingers gently untangling a few of my black long coils that had escaped my updo. "Somewhere the noise can't reach us," he murmured, his thumb brushing over my pulse point. "Somewhere I can look at you without wanting to break the jaw of every man in the room." The flight was a blur of quiet intimacy. The moment the private jet leveled out over the clouds, Minho pulled me across the plush leather seats until I was straddling his lap, my head resting heavy over his heart. He didn't sleep, but he was completely at peace, his large hands slowly, rhythmically tracing the line of my spine for hours. I listened to the steady, powerful thumping in his chest, marveling at the fact that I held the absolute surrender of the most dangerous man in Seoul. When we finally landed, the freezing, damp chill of London was entirely gone, replaced by the thick, intoxicating heat of the tropics. We had arrived on a private island in the Maldives. There was no staff waiting to greet us. There were no bodyguards forming a perimeter. Minho had dismissed everyone. He led me down a wooden walkway illuminated by low, golden lanterns, straight toward a secluded villa built directly over the crystal-clear ocean. The Hansong Board originally purchased this atoll to develop a series of elite wellness retreats, Minho said quietly as he unlocked the heavy wooden doors. The sound of the ocean lapping gently against the stilts beneath us filled the quiet night. I blocked the development. I kept the island empty. I used to come here when the screaming in my head got too loud, hoping the isolation would force me to sleep. It never worked. He closed the door behind us, the heavy click of the lock echoing in the sprawling, beautiful space. But I didn't care about the architecture. I didn't care about the panoramic ocean views or the sheer luxury of the villa. I only cared about the man standing in front of me, slowly unbuttoning his tuxedo jacket. "Why didn't it work?" I asked softly, dropping my clutch onto a table and walking toward him. Minho let the expensive jacket fall to the floor. He reached up, pulling the bow tie loose and unfastening the first 3 buttons of his crisp white shirt. The dark, intricate dragon tattoo creeping up the left side of his neck flexed as he let out a long, shuddering breath. "Because isolation isn't peace, Sasha," he whispered, his dark eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that paralyzed my lungs. "I didn't need a quiet island. I needed you." The intensive therapy sessions funded by the foundation, the medications, the doctors, none of it could fix the fact that my soul was entirely empty. Until you played that violin. Until you pushed past me in that station and refused to be bought. I stepped entirely into his space, my hands reaching up to rest flat against his warm, hard chest. He closed his eyes at the contact, a heavy groan vibrating deep in his throat. "You are so beautiful," he rasped, his hands coming down to rest heavily on my hips. "I spent the entire gala watching you outshine every billionaire and dignitary in that room. You carry yourself like royalty, Sasha. But right now..." He slowly opened his eyes, the absolute, predatory obsession melting into a deep, agonizing reverence. "Right now, I just want my girl. I want to take this dress off you and worship the woman who saved my life." My breath hitched. The sensual tension in the room spiked so violently it felt like a physical shockwave. I nodded, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Minho's hands moved the zipper at the back of my emerald gown. His movements weren't rushed or frantic. They were agonizingly slow, deeply deliberate. As the heavy silk pulled around my feet, he carefully pulled the pins from my hair, letting my thick, black long coils fall freely down my back. He took a step back, his eyes slowly sweeping over my body. The sheer, overwhelming worship in his gaze made my skin flush with a burning, intoxicating heat. He wasn't just looking at me with desire, he was looking at me like I was a deity he had prayed to his entire life. He closed the distance between us, suddenly dropping to his knees on the polished hardwood floor. I gasped, my hands instinctively reaching down to grip his broad shoulders. "Minho, what are you doing?" He didn't answer right away. He pressed a soft, lingering kiss to my stomach, his arms wrapping tightly around my waist, holding me against him as if I were his only anchor to the earth. I felt a slight tremor in his massive frame, a vulnerability so profound it brought tears to my eyes. When he finally looked up at me, the 35-year-old Mafia boss was completely stripped of his armor. There were tears shining in his pitch-black eyes. "I have commanded thousands of men," he whispered, his voice incredibly rough, vibrating with raw emotion. "I have controlled global shipping routes, broken rival syndicates, and survived assassins. But I have never been more terrified than I am at this exact moment." He reached into the pocket of his trousers, pulling out a small, incredibly simple velvet box. My hands flew to my mouth to muffle a sob. Minho flipped the box open. Inside rested a diamond so flawless, so breathtakingly clear, it seemed to catch the moonlight filtering through the room. But it wasn't a gaudy, massive stone meant for a corporate buyout. It was an elegant, vintage cut, surrounded by delicate gold, designed with absolute, thoughtful perfection. "I didn't want to do this in front of the cameras," Minho continued, his voice thick and wavering. "I didn't want to do this in London, surrounded by my mother's guards or my security detail. I wanted to be just a man, asking the woman who holds his actual soul for her mercy." He took a deep, trembling breath, his dark eyes never leaving mine. And then, the ruthless Korean billionaire spoke in a language he had spent the last 2 weeks desperately studying in secret. "Ahuru mgi ananya, I love you," he whispered, his accent thick but his pronunciation incredibly deliberate, filled with absolute reverence. "I love you." The tears spilled over my cheeks, hot and fast. I couldn't breathe. I was completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his devotion. "You told me once that your soul wasn't for sale," Minho said, pulling the ring from the box. "I am not trying to buy it, Sasha. I am asking you to let me protect it. Let me spend the rest of my life worshipping the ground you walk on. Let me be the man who makes sure you never have to be afraid, or cold, or hungry ever again. Be my peace." Be my queen. Marry me. Yes, I sobbed, collapsing onto my knees right there on the floor in front of him. Yes, Minho. Yes. He let out a choked breath, his hands shaking violently as he slid the cold gold onto my ring finger. The moment it was in place, he didn't even look at the diamond. He dropped the box, his large hands immediately framing my face as he pulled me into a kiss that shattered every remaining boundary between us. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was desperate, consuming, and entirely possessive. All the intense restraint he had shown over the past few weeks broke completely. He tasted like salt and whiskey and absolute salvation. My hands tangled in his gold-brown hair as he easily lifted me off the floor, his arms locking around me like a vice as he carried me toward the massive, white-draped bed. The sound of the ocean outside was completely drowned out by the heavy, frantic rhythm of our breathing. He laid me back against the pillows, his powerful body covering mine, his mouth trailing fire down my jawline to the sensitive skin of my neck. In the quiet, isolated sanctuary of the island, the Ghost of Seoul finally died entirely, leaving behind only the man who belonged to me completely. The Maldives sun was blindingly bright, pouring through the sheer white drapes of the overwater villa. I woke up with my face pressed against the warm, solid expanse of Minho's bare chest. His arm was a heavy, immovable weight locked around my waist, keeping me completely pinned to his side. I didn't try to move. I just lay there, listening to the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart, feeling the heavy vintage diamond ring cold against my skin. He was already awake, his pitch-black eyes tracing the ceiling, but the moment I shifted, his gaze snapped down to me. The raw, unfiltered obsession in his look stole the breath right out of my lungs. He didn't say good morning. He simply rolled over, caging me beneath his massive frame, his mouth descending on mine with a hungry, desperate heat that proved the Ghost of Seoul was truly gone, leaving only a man completely consumed by his wife. We stayed hidden from the world for 3 perfect days. No bodyguards, no corporate espionage, no violence. Just the crashing waves and the intense, burning reality of his devotion. But the Hansong Empire could not run on autopilot forever, even with their advanced AI tools for business operations managing the global shipping matrices. We had a wedding to plan, and more importantly, we had families to unite. The flight back to London was a whirlwind of anticipation. I was terrified. My mother, a proud, traditional Igbo woman from Enugu, was flying first class into the heart of a Korean billionaire syndicate. Minho had spared no expense. He had sent his personal security detail to escort her and my 2 uncles safely out of Nigeria. He even arranged for a specialized concierge medical team to travel with them, ensuring my mother's blood pressure remained completely stable during the long flight. When we finally arrived at the massive, heavily guarded London estate Minho had purchased specifically for this gathering, my stomach was tied in knots. I stood in the grand marble foyer, twisting the diamond ring on my finger. Minho stepped up behind me, his hands settling firmly on my hips. He pulled my back flush against his chest, his lips pressing a soft, reassuring kiss to the side of my neck. "Breathe, Sasha," he murmured, his deep voice vibrating against my skin. "They are your family. Which means they are my family now. I will treat them with the exact same reverence I treat you." The heavy oak doors opened. My mother walked in wearing a vibrant, intricately patterned Ankara wrapper, her head held high. My uncles flanked her, looking around the sprawling, billion-dollar estate with wide, cautious eyes. "Mama," I choked out, breaking away from Minho and running across the marble floor. I threw my arms around her, burying my face in her shoulder, inhaling the familiar scent of shea butter and home. She held me incredibly tight, her hands trembling as she stroked my long black coils. "My daughter," she whispered, pulling back to look at my face, her eyes scanning the subtle changes in me. She saw the diamond. She saw the expensive silk dress. But mostly, she saw the absolute, terrifying man standing a few feet away, watching us with quiet, lethal intensity. Minho didn't wait for an introduction. He stepped forward, bridging the gap between his dark, violent world and my mother's quiet pride. He didn't extend his hand for a business shake. To the absolute shock of my uncles, the ruthless, 35-year-old Korean billionaire bowed deeply, a perfect, traditional 90-degree angle of absolute respect. "Welcome to our home, Mama," Minho said, his voice smooth and entirely sincere. He looked up, meeting her cautious gaze head-on. "I have promised your daughter my life, my empire, and my absolute devotion. I humbly ask for your blessing to spend the rest of my days proving I am worthy of her." My mother stared at him. She was a woman who had survived poverty, loss, and the harsh realities of the world. She knew a dangerous man when she saw one. But as she looked into Minho's eyes, she didn't see a threat. She saw the invisible, unbreakable chain that tied his massive soul directly to mine. A slow, beautiful smile spread across her face. "You have already proven it," she said softly. "You kept my child safe. That is all a mother ever asks." The tension in the massive foyer completely dissolved. But the true test came an hour later when Madame Han descended the grand staircase. The architect of the Syndicate, dressed in a flawless cream blazer, walked directly toward my mother. I held my breath, feeling Minho's hand slip into mine, his thumb rubbing soothing circles into my palm. Madame Han stopped in front of my mother. Two matriarchs from entirely different universes. Madame Han didn't offer a cold corporate greeting. She reached out and gently took my mother's hands on her own. "Your daughter," Madame Han said, her voice carrying a rare, genuine warmth, "has brought light back into my son's eyes. For that, the Hansong family owes you a debt we can never repay. I have arranged for you to spend the next month at one of our private, luxury wellness retreats in the Swiss Alps, fully funded by the foundation, to ensure you are perfectly rested before the ceremony." My mother laughed, a rich, joyous sound that echoed off the marble walls. "Thank you, madam. But first, we must eat." The dinner that followed was a surreal, beautiful masterpiece. Minho had transformed the formal dining room into a celebration of two clashing, vibrant cultures. The long oak table was covered in a feast that smelled like absolute heaven. There were perfectly seared cuts of premium Korean hanwoo beef, delicate side dishes, and right next to them, massive, steaming bowls of rich Nigerian egusi soup and soft, perfectly pounded yam. There was no awkwardness. There was only harmony. My uncles, initially intimidated by the sheer wealth of the room, were soon loudly debating global politics with Minho, who listened with genuine, deep respect. Madame Han sat next to my mother, the two women quietly discussing the intricacies of running a household, completely ignoring the language barrier thanks to the seamless live translation devices Minho had provided. I sat next to the man who was going to be my husband, my heart so full it felt like it might burst. Minho wasn't eating much. He was just watching me. His pitch-black eyes tracked every smile, every laugh that escaped my lips. He reached under the heavy linen tablecloth, his large, warm hand finding my thigh. His long fingers squeezed gently, a silent, possessive claim that sent a rush of pure heat straight to my core. I turned my head to look at him, the noise of our families fading into the background. The intense, burning desire radiating from his gaze was overwhelming. He leaned in, his lips brushing against my ear, sending a violent shiver down my spine. "Look at what you built," he whispered, his breath hot against my skin. "You took a monster who lived in the dark, and you gave him a family. I am entirely, completely obsessed with you, Sasha." I leaned my head against his broad shoulder, completely surrendering to the absolute safety of his embrace. The wars were over. The Syndicate was quiet. In just a few days, I was going to walk down the aisle and become his wife. And looking around that table, at the beautiful, impossible peace we had created, I closed my eyes, letting the heavy, comforting weight of his presence anchor my soul. I was no longer just a struggling student fighting to survive the harsh London streets. I was a queen. The weight of the heavy, cold coral beads resting against my collarbones was a grounding force. I stood in the massive, opulent dressing room of the London manor, staring at my reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirror. My mother stood behind me, her hands gently adjusting the vibrant, intricately beaded George wrapper around my waist. The fabric was a deep, rich crimson, a stark contrast to my glowing dark brown skin. My long, dark coils were styled perfectly, woven with golden ornaments that caught the light with every slight movement of my head. I took a deep, trembling breath, trying to steady the frantic beating of my heart. The journey to this exact moment felt like a lifetime. The violent nightmares of the alleyway and the warehouse had finally faded, replaced by a profound, unshakable peace. We had utilized the elite therapy sessions funded by the foundation to process the trauma, and the world-class medical care after the injury had ensured Minho's shoulder was completely healed. We weren't just surviving anymore. Through the philanthropic arm of the Syndicate, we were actively deploying advanced AI tools for business operations to streamline global supply chains, specifically funding state-of-the-art health treatments and luxury wellness retreats for marginalized women. I had stepped into my power, and Minho had built an impenetrable fortress around it. "You are ready, my daughter," my mother whispered, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to my cheek. She handed me the ornately carved wooden cup filled with fresh palm wine. "Go and find your husband." The heavy oak doors opened. The rhythmic, thumping bass line of traditional Igbo drums immediately filled my chest. I stepped out into the grand ballroom of the manor, and the sheer scale of the gathering took my breath away. It was a breathtaking collision of two entirely different empires. The sharp, tailored suits of the Korean Mafia elites mixed seamlessly with the vibrant, flowing agbadas and colorful geli head ties of my Nigerian relatives. There was no tension in the room, only joyous, overwhelming celebration. I began the traditional dance, my hips swaying to the heavy beat of the drums, my eyes scanning the massive crowd. The ritual of the Igba Nkwu demanded that I search the room, ignoring the playful distractions of other men, until I found the one my soul recognized. It didn't take long. He was impossible to miss. Minho was seated across the room, surrounded by his most loyal men and my beaming uncles. He wasn't wearing an expensive charcoal suit today. My heart physically ached at the sight of him. He was wearing a custom-tailored, dark velvet isiagu, the traditional Igbo lion head tunic. The rich fabric draped perfectly across his broad, muscular shoulders, the golden lion heads complementing his sleek, gold-brown hair. He wore the traditional red chief's cap, tilting slightly over his pitch-black eyes. The dark, intricate dragon tattoo creeping up his neck was fully visible, a dangerous, beautiful reminder of the world he ruled. He wasn't smiling. He was watching me approach with a raw, unfiltered obsession that made the air evaporate from my lungs. The entire crowded ballroom seemed to blur and fade away until there was only him. Every step I took toward him felt like gravity was pulling me directly into his center. I stopped a few feet away from him. The drums reached a fever pitch. Minho's chest was heaving, his dark eyes burning with an intense, possessive hunger that was so heavy it felt like a physical touch. He didn't break eye contact. He was waiting for me to claim him in front of both of our worlds. Quick pause right here. We are seconds away from the ultimate climax of this story. If you want to see Minho finally claim his queen and witness this beautiful ending, write a comment, subscribe, and like Story's Pulse right now. Remember, this is part 2 of this particular story, so if you want part 1, check the description below. Alright, let's finish this beautiful journey. I slowly lowered myself, the heavy silk and beads of my wrapper pooling around me as I knelt on the plush carpet right in front of him. I raised my eyes, holding his dark, intense gaze, and offered him the wooden cup of palm wine with both hands. Minho's hands were trembling slightly as he reached out. His long, scarred fingers brushed against mine, sending a violent, electric shock straight to my core. He didn't just take a sip. He drained the cup, his eyes never leaving mine, accepting me, my culture, and my heart completely. The moment the cup left his lips, he didn't wait for the applause. He reached down, his large hands gripping my waist with a fierce, possessive strength, and pulled me forcefully up from the floor. He didn't care about the hundreds of people watching. He wrapped his arms around me, crushing me against his solid chest. I dropped the wooden cup, my hands instantly tangling in the velvet of his tunic. He buried his face in the crook of my neck, inhaling my scent like a starving man. My wife, he breathed roughly against my skin, the sound vibrating with absolute, agonizing devotion. My queen, you are my entire world. The crowd erupted into deafening cheers. I felt the shower of crisp currency raining down around us as my family and his syndicate bosses celebrated the union. I pulled back just enough to rest my forehead heavily against his, looking into those pitch-black eyes that had once held so much torment. There was no darkness left. There was only a blinding, overwhelming light, and it belonged entirely to me. 5 years later, the heavy silence of the Royal Albert Hall was broken only by the achingly mournful, beautiful notes of an 18th-century Guarneri violin. I stood center stage, the spotlight warming my dark skin. I closed my eyes, letting the music flow from my soul, pulling the emotion right out of the marrow of the 5,000 people sitting in the darkness. I wasn't playing for tips in a freezing underground station anymore. I was playing on the grandest stage in the world, and I didn't owe a single penny of my success to anyone but the fierce, unwavering support of my husband. As the final, resonant note faded into the velvet walls, the crowd erupted into a thunderous standing ovation. I lowered my bow, opening my eyes, but I didn't look at the massive sea of faces. My gaze dropped immediately to the absolute center of the front VIP row. Minho was standing there. He was wearing an impeccably tailored dark suit, looking just as dangerous and impossibly handsome as the day he first stepped out of that Maybach in the rain. But the terrifying aura of the Ghost of Seoul was completely neutralized by the 2 children currently trying to climb his broad shoulders. He was effortlessly holding our 4-year-old twins, a boy with my dark, thick coils and his father's sharp jawline, and a girl with his sleek, gold-brown hair and my deep brown eyes. They were clapping wildly, yelling for their mother over the roar of the crowd. Minho wasn't looking at them. He was staring up at me. His pitch-black eyes held that exact same, unwavering obsession. 5 years of marriage, 5 years of running a global empire, and he still looked at me like I was the only oxygen left on Earth. I smiled, resting my hand instinctively over the visible, heavy curve of my stomach, where our 3rd child was currently kicking against my ribs in time with the applause. Minho saw the gesture. The corner of his mouth twitched upward into a slow, breathtakingly soft smile. He pressed a kiss to our daughter's head, his dark eyes locking onto mine with a silent, profound promise of absolute, eternal protection. I took my final bow, the heat of his gaze wrapping around me like a heavy, comforting blanket. People used to whisper about the monster who ruled the London underworld. They said he was ruthless, cold, and entirely untouchable. He wanted to control the world, but as I walked off that stage and straight into his waiting, protective arms, I knew the absolute truth. He was perfectly, beautifully happy just to let me control his heart.